In the early hours of June 6, 1989, somewhere 300 miles off the eastern coast of New Zealand, 4 men were trapped inside a living nightmare. There was no light, no sky, no horizon. There was only the deafening roar of 30-foot seas, the smell of spilled diesel, and the freezing, jet-black water sloshing around their chests. Moments earlier, they had been aboard a modern 40-foot trimaran named the Rose-Noëlle, sailing toward the warm waters of Tonga. Now, the ocean had done the unthinkable. A monster rogue wave, a wall of black water rising out of the gale, had struck the vessel from the beam, lifting its 3 hulls and flipping the entire boat upside down in a fraction of a second. Inside the main cabin, the world violently inverted. Everything not bolted down crashed onto the ceiling. Electronics, canned food, navigation charts, glass bottles, and 4 human bodies collided in pitch darkness. As the air hissed out of the hull and cold Pacific seawater surged inside, the 4 men scrambled upward in the dark, gasping for whatever pocket of trapped air remained near the upturned floorboards. They were 4 men: John Glennie, the boat's designer and skipper, Rick Hellriegel, Jim Nalepka, and Phil Hofman. When the violence of the capsize finally subsided, an eerie, suffocating silence settled over the wreckage. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, it was pitch black, cold, and unnaturally cramped. The boat was floating upside down, held buoyant only by air trapped inside its fiberglass hulls and sealed compartments. They were floating in a giant, inverted coffin. The immediate survival shock quickly gave way to a terrifying realization. The water inside the cabin was waist-deep and freezing. The temperature in the South Pacific during June, the southern winter, was cold enough to trigger hypothermia in less than an hour. They could not stand up because the ceiling was now their floor. They could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Every movement brought them into contact with floating debris, sharp, shattered fiberglass, or floating pools of engine oil and diesel fuel that burned their eyes and skin. For the first 48 hours, there was no sleep. There was only endurance. The 4 men crammed themselves into a tiny, dry space inside the central hull, a section barely 6 feet long and 4 feet wide. To stay out of the freezing water below, they managed to rig a makeshift plywood platform just inches above the water level inside the inverted cabin. They were squeezed together so tightly that if one man needed to turn over, all 4 had to move in unison. Above them, the ocean pounded relentlessly against the overturned bottom of the boat. Below them, visible only through the dark, murky water inside their living quarters, lay the submerged wreckage of their former vessel. If they were going to survive, they needed food and fresh water, but everything they owned was trapped deep underwater, buried in the submerged sections of the upside-down boat. This led to one of the most nerve-wracking routines of their ordeal: blind salvage diving inside a sunken ship. John Glennie and Rick Hellriegel had to take turns taking a deep breath, plunging beneath the oily, jet-black water inside the cabin, and swimming downward into the submerged compartments. In total darkness, holding their breath for as long as their burning lungs would allow, they had to feel around with their bare hands, dodging floating wires, jagged metal, and tangled ropes that could easily trap a man underwater forever. One wrong turn in the dark, one snag on a loose line, and a diver would drown just feet away from his companions, beneath the floorboards of their tiny dry shelter. Yet, drive by sheer instinct, they kept diving. Hand over hand, feeling along the submerged bulkheads, they retrieved precious items: a few tins of canned food, a hammer, a saw, a portable radio, and crucial tools. Using the saw, they meticulously cut a tiny hatch through the fiberglass hull, just above the waterline, giving them their very first glimpse of sunlight after days in complete darkness, and more importantly, a crude vent for fresh air. As the days turned into weeks, a psychological dread began to set in. The overturned Rose-Noëlle did not sink, but it drifted aimlessly in one of the most treacherous ocean regions on Earth, the Southern Ocean's Roaring Forties. The men were entirely cut off from the world. Search and rescue operations had been launched, but searching for a dark, upside-down hull in millions of square miles of stormy ocean was like hunting for a needle in a midnight desert. Ships passed miles away, completely unaware of the four souls trapped inside the floating shadow below the horizon. Inside the hull, life took on a surreal, almost claustrophobic rhythm. The upside-down boat began to develop its own bizarre ecosystem. Barnacles and sea anemones started growing across the submerged cabin walls. Small fish began swimming inside the flooded sections of the boat. Eventually, the underside of the trimaran became a floating artificial reef in the open ocean, and with small sea life came the apex predators. In the dead of night, as the four men lay shoulder to shoulder on their damp plywood shelf, they would hear heavy, deliberate scraping noises echoing directly through the thin fiberglass hull beneath their heads. Large pelagic sharks, drawn by the floating structure and the smell of fish, were rubbing against the hull, circling the inverted boat just inches away from where the men lay sleeping. The sensation was terrifying. Lying in pitch darkness, feeling the vibration of a massive shark bumping against the very panel of wood supporting your back. One thin layer of fiberglass was all that separated them from the icy ocean and the jaws of deep-sea scavengers. Fresh water was a constant life-or-death battle. To survive, they engineered a rainwater catchment system on the upturned bottom of the hull, funneling precious drops through plastic tubing into salvaged containers. When rainwater failed, they were forced to ration tiny sips. For food, they relied on bare-handed ingenuity. They attached a makeshift spear to a wooden pole and spent hours staring into the murky water inside the cabin, waiting for small fish or sea anemones to drift close enough to strike. By day 50, bodily decay and mental exhaustion took a heavy toll. Their clothes were constantly damp, rotting away on their skin. Salt sores broke out across their bodies, making every small movement painful. The psychological friction between four men trapped in a dark space no larger than a storage closet threatened to tear them apart. Arguments flared over tiny drops of water, equal food portions, or how long someone held a flashlight. Yet, beneath the tension, a deep, silent pact kept them alive. No one gave up. They maintained strict hygiene rules, kept a daily log, and instituted forced conversation topics to keep their minds from snapping under the weight of total isolation. By day 90, the men had been written off by the world. Official search operations had ceased months ago. Memorial services had been held back in New Zealand. Families had grieved. To the rest of humanity, the crew of the Rose-Noëlle was dead, buried somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. In reality, they were still drifting. The winter storms of the South Pacific were pushing the overturned hull westward, carrying it across thousands of miles of open sea toward the jagged coastline of New Zealand. But this presented a new, lethal threat. An upside-down boat has no steering, no engine, and no sails. If the ocean current dragged them onto a rocky reef or high cliff face in the middle of a storm, the fragile, air-filled hull would be smashed to splinters against the rocks, killing them instantly. On the night of October 2nd, 1989, 118 days after the capsize, the atmosphere inside the cabin changed. The long, rhythmic swell of the deep ocean suddenly turned sharp, chaotic, and violent. Through their tiny air hatch, the men could hear a sound that made their blood run cold, the thunderous, explosive roar of ocean breakers hitting land. They were drifting rapidly toward a coast in total darkness. They had no idea if they were about to be thrown against vertical stone cliffs or washed onto a sandy beach. In the early morning hours of October 3rd, day 119, a massive wave seized the overturned Rose-Noëlle. The boat was lifted high into the air, hurled violently forward, and slammed down onto hard ground with a sickening crunch. The hull ground against sharp rocks and gravel as foam hissed through the broken hatch. Silence fell. Trembling, weak, and malnourished, the four men squeezed through the tiny escape hatch and stepped out onto solid ground for the first time in 4 months. They had washed ashore on the desolate southern end of Great Barrier Island, off the coast of New Zealand. They were gaunt, bearded, weathered, and drenched in salt, but all four were alive. When they eventually stumbled upon a remote beach cottage. The owner, who opened the door, was terrified. He was looking at four men who looked like ghosts from the deep, men whose names had been printed in obituaries months prior. When news broke that the crew of the Rose-Noëlle had survived 119 days inside an overturned boat, the world was stunned. In fact, the story was so extraordinary, so seemingly impossible, that government officials and journalists initially suspected it was a laborative hoax. How could four men survive 4 months inside a submerged, upside-down hull without dying of starvation, thirst, or hypothermia? An official maritime inquiry was launched. Investigators examined the recovered wreckage of the Rose-Noëlle. What they found silenced every skeptic. The inside of the boat was covered in 4 months of marine growth, barnacles, fish bones, and ingenious makeshift survival tools. The physical evidence was undeniable. The story of the Rose-Noëlle remains one of the most incredible survival sagas in maritime history, a terrifying testament to human adaptability. It proved that even when the ocean turns your world upside down, turning a floating coffin into a sanctuary comes down to a choice: total panic or absolute, unrelenting resolve. If you were trapped in that pitch-black, flooded hull, what aspect of the ordeal do you think would be the hardest to overcome? The physical claustrophobia or the psychological horror of what was swimming just inches beneath your feet?